Hello there, my name is Howard Nye and I'm an associate professor in philosophy at the University of Alberta. And my talk today, as you can see, is going to be on why we should reduce our own emissions, expected consequences, and the ethics of making an indeterminate difference. And if you'd like to see the full paper from which this talk is drawn, I've got a link below to it in the description, and there you can see my references and everything else. Okay. So the ethical issue that I'm going to be dealing with in my talk is why should we try to reduce our destructive impacts on the environment when it can seem that the effects of our individual acts are too small to make an ethically important difference. And as in the philosophical literature on this, as Walterson and Armstrong puts it, why, for instance, should we seek to reduce our own emissions of greenhouse gases by cycling and taking public transit instead of driving, if it seems that climate change occurs on such a massive scale that my individual driving makes no difference to the well-being of anyone? This is, in fact, an instance of a very general ethical problem about collective action, which is of both great practical and theoretical importance. So practically, such worries about the causal efficacy of a given party reducing its emissions have been used by some to justify individuals living high carbon lifestyles and waiting around for governments to address climate change. Some in progressive circles who criticize what they pejoratively call lifestyleism or ethical consumerism seem close to suggesting this kind of thing. But unfortunately, for a lot of those who make these kinds of criticisms, exactly similar concerns about the efficacy of individual contributions can be used as justifications for individuals to refrain from participating in political action to try to get their governments to address climate change through the thought that, for example, your vote won't make any difference. And indeed, for individual governments and agencies not to act to reduce emissions. So unfortunately, it's become a bit of a standard right-wing talking point that it's futile for countries like the United States to try to reduce their emissions because other countries will continue to emit. And there's been an unfortunate recent example of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration defending its fuel efficiency rollbacks on the grounds that other actors' greenhouse gas emissions will cause harmful climate change regardless of what the NHTSA does. So theoretically, this issue about collective action problems raises the concern of whether in general there are moral reasons for individuals to act in collective action cases, and what theory best explains this. So according to the general theoretical approach that I'm going to be defending in this talk, what we might call the expected consequences approach, in collective action cases where our acts together are collectively harmful or beneficial, our individual acts do in fact have a chance, often small, of causing harm or benefit, often large, to others. As such, the moral importance of avoiding this risk of harm or securing this chance of benefit typically outweighs the possible benefits to us of performing or failing to perform these acts. So the expected consequences approach, one nice thing about it is that it explains our moral reasons to omit being complicit in harmful practices and contribute to beneficial practices in terms of familiar principles of just non-maleficence, not to harm others, beneficence to benefit others, and responsible decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. So we don't, on this view, need to add any fundamentally distinct ethical principles to those of moral theories like Rossian pluralism, according to which there's a plurality of basic moral reasons to act, including non-maleficence and beneficence, and act consequentialism, according to which our moral reasons to do something are proportional simply to the amount of good it will do. Nor, if the expected consequences approach is correct, do we need to add any fundamentally new principles of responsible decision-making under conditions of uncertainty beyond the teachings of standard decision theory, according to which, very roughly, we should weigh in favor of an act the benefits it may bring in proportion to their magnitude and likelihood of occurring, what we might call its expected benefits, and weigh against an act the harms it may produce in proportion to their magnitude and likelihood of occurring, which we may call its expected harms. So advocates of the expected consequences approach, as I'll discuss in this talk, have argued convincingly that it can provide a plausible account of the moral case for doing things to reduce our ecological footprints, such as voting, eating plant-based diets, cycling and taking public transit, and, importantly for this context, e-conferencing. But this argument has recently been challenged by Bernard Gesang's contention that it may be genuinely impossible for our individual emissions to make a difference to morally important outcomes. So what I'm going to be doing in this talk is arguing that Gesang has shown at most that our emissions could have metaphysically indeterministic effects on morally important outcomes which lack precise objective chances. But the expected consequences approach has already been extended to cases of indeterminism and imprecise probabilities, and I show how these extensions can vindicate the application of the approach to the scenario of climate change that Gesang attempts to describe. Okay, so the expected consequences approach explains our moral reasons in collective action cases in terms of extremely plausible general principles of non-maleficence, beneficence, and standard decision theory's injunction to weigh acts' expected harms against their expected benefits. So these entail that there can be a decisive moral case against performing an act because it carries a small risk of causing a great deal of harm in return for relatively small expected benefits. So I think this provides an explanation of why there's a decisive moral case against such acts as speeding through residential areas when you're just late for work, or bouncing a ball around a nuclear missile's launch button just for fun, or shooting into an occupied building just for target practice. And these principles also provide a very plausible and helpful way to determine when an act that would otherwise be wrong in virtue of its risks becomes permissible. Namely, when its expected benefits are great enough in comparison to its expected harms. So I think this can explain very nicely why there is no decisive moral case against, but plausibly a decisive moral case in favor of such acts as driving at high speeds through residential areas and shooting into occupied buildings, if these are the only ways to rush someone in need of urgent care to the hospital or to defuse a bomb about to explode and kill someone. And the expected consequences approach can actually be applied very straightforwardly to some collective action cases, starting with the collective action case of voting. So to see this, consider the Simpsons-inspired case of voting for Kang. So in this case, hypothetical case, it's revealed that one of the major party candidates for president in the United States is actually an evil alien named Kang, who will enslave and torture everyone in the country with no benefits to anyone other than US citizens, if and only if he wins the election. In this case, the other candidate, unlike in the Citizens Kang episode, is a typical politician who will maintain the status quo. Kang has, however, rigged the voting booths to pay out $50 to everyone who votes for him. So it seems, I think, very clear that in such a case one has decisive moral reason to forego the $50 and not vote for Kang, and indeed decisive moral reason to vote against him. And as Derek Parfit has argued, this can be justified very nicely by the expected consequences approach. So to update Parfit's calculations, there are about 326 million United States citizens, and one's average probability of one's own vote deciding a presidential election is about 1 in 60 million, although it's different depending on which state you live in and you're voting in. So using this average case, the expected harm to others of voting for Kang is 1 out of 60 million times H times 326 million, which is 5.44 times H, where H is the per citizen harm that will be inflicted by Kang if he wins. So then very clearly, the certain benefit to you of $50, which we can assume if we like can be spent before Kang takes power if he wins, is absolutely trivial in comparison to the per individual harm inflicted by Kang on just one other individual, let alone an expected harm more than 5 times as great. And to appreciate the expected benefit of voting to reduce our country's greenhouse gas emissions, we could consider, say, an election between the candidates we'll call superior and inferior, where superior, if she wins, will implement a Green New Deal that will reduce the emissions of the United States to net zero by 2050, increasing employment and stimulating aggregate demand. And inferior, if she wins, will maintain the status quo on US emissions. So John Nolt estimates, as I'll be discussing more below, the expected harm of an average US citizen's current lifetime emissions is something like 1 to 2 human lives lost. And what this means is that the expected benefit of voting for superior due simply to lives saved by zeroing out net emissions is your 1 out of 60 million chance of deciding the election times the 326 to 652 million lives that can be expected to be saved by this policy, or 5.43 to 10.87 lives saved. So the cost to you of voting is absolutely trivial in comparison to the moral importance of saving more than 5 to 10 lives. So the expected consequences approach naturally delivers the result that obviously it's morally imperative to vote. So indeed, even if you live in Wyoming and we take the more conservative estimate of superior saving 326 million lives, the expected benefit of voting for Superior will still be a 1 in 30 billion chance of deciding the election if you live in the not so competitive state of Wyoming, times 326 million lives saved, or 0.0109 lives saved, which, assuming a life expectancy of 80 years, is equivalent to saving, extending someone's life by 317.31 days of life. And again, here, the cost to you of voting seems totally trivial compared to the moral importance of preventing someone from being deprived of 317.31 days of life. And indeed, even if Superior would only reduce emissions by just 10% or even just 1%, the expected benefits of a vote for Superior, even just in Wyoming, would still be 31.73 or 3.17 full days of life, which still clearly outweighs the cost to you of voting. Way more important to save someone from losing a month or even just 3 days of life than the cost to you of sparing yourself the cost of going to vote. So voting is a paradigm case of what Shelley Kagan calls a triggering case, where if a certain threshold of individual contributions is crossed, this triggers a morally important effect. So in a triggering case, if your act is part of a cohort that falls short of the triggering number or adds to the surplus above the triggering number, then it, as well as all other members of the cohort, makes no difference to the effect. But if your act is part of a cohort that exactly crosses the threshold and triggers the effect, then it, as well as all the other acts in the cohort, makes all the difference to that effect happening as opposed to not. So to a first approximation, voting is a triggering case where one's act has a chance of crossing only a single important triggering threshold, although in reality, it's a little more complicated because there are likely mandate and policy effects coming from margins of victory. So even if your act doesn't swing in an election, it still might add to the margin of victory or take away from the margin of defeat. But there are other clear cases where your act clearly has a chance of being part of several cohorts, each of which exactly cross different thresholds that trigger morally important effects. And there are many important cases like this, and as authors like Peter Singer, Gavrik Matheny, Alistair Norcross, and Shelley Kagan have argued, purchasing animal products instead of plant-based alternatives is an instance of a triggering case like this, where your purchase has a small chance of crossing many thresholds, each of which would result in a great deal of harm to animals and the environment. So, for example, given the price mechanism in a market economy, there must be some number n, for example 10,000, of additional chicken purchases that causes n more chickens to be bred, tortured, and killed, at the expense of much more land, grain, and water inputs and polluting waste and greenhouse gas emissions than the consumption of plant-based alternatives instead. So in this kind of case, in n-1 out of n cases, so like in 9,999 out of 10,000 cases, your purchase will not make the crucial difference between being part of a cohort that does not, as opposed to does, cause another n or 10,000 chickens to be destructively tortured and killed. But in 1 out of n, say 1 out of 10,000 cases, your act will make this crucial difference. So the expected harm then of your act of purchasing a chicken is actually 1 out of n times h, so 1 out of 10,000 times 10,000 times h, where h is the harm done to a chicken by being tortured and killed, together with the environmental cost of doing this to her. So the act thus has the same expected harm and is as morally important to avoid as directly torturing and killing one chicken and causing the attendant ecological damage for the mere taste pleasure of eating her. So as John Broome, Avram Hiller, Christopher Morgan-Knapp, and Charles Goodman have argued, I think very convincingly, there are other instances of generating profligate greenhouse gases that are also triggering cases with many thresholds like this. And of course, these are cases of emitting greenhouse gases other than buying animal products, which are actually a very profligate emitter of greenhouse gases, animal products being responsible for at least 14.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which is more than all transportation exhaust combined. So yeah, so they've argued that these are, these other ways of emitting greenhouse gases by, say, flying or driving, they're also triggering cases which have many chances of triggering harmful outcomes. So as John Broome observes, greenhouse gas harms people in multifarious ways. Each of them is chancy to some extent. A particular storm will be harmful only if the water rises above the flood defenses. Each increase in the amount of greenhouse gas in the air slightly increases the quantity of rain, but it will be a matter of chance whether the particular quantity of gas you emit this year will be enough to cause a flood on any particular occasion. Your emission increases the likelihood of a flood, but it might not actually cause any particular flood. But during the centuries that they're in the air, your emissions will have the chance of causing harm on innumerable occasions, and it's extraordinarily unlikely that they'll do no harm at all. So Broom's actually here talking about our lifetime emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, as opposed to our emissions from a particular act of, say, driving or flying or something. But even if the emissions from a particular act like driving are likely to do no harm, as Christopher Morgan Knapp and Charles Goodman argue, they do in fact have a small chance of causing a huge amount of damage, like in the chicken purchasing case. So they can do this, Morgan Knapp and Goodman argue, through dramatic butterfly effects that cascade into harmful events like storms, floods, droughts, and heat waves. And because climate science dictates that acts which emit greenhouse gases are more likely to have these butterfly effect caused harms and no more likely to have butterfly effect caused benefits than their omission, these small chances of great harm are not counterbalanced by equally sized butterfly effect caused benefits and don't drop out of the decision theoretic calculation. So, moreover, as Avram Hiller's argued, because an emission's chances of crossing thresholds and triggering these harmful effects is proportionate to its size, and we know of nothing else that makes any given emission more or less likely to have these effects, we can in fact determine an emission's expected harm by multiplying the total expected harm of our collective emissions by the ratio of any given emission's size to that of the collective amount. So John Nolt actually employs this method and uses it to estimate the expected harm of the 1,840 metric tons of CO2 equivalent emitted by an average US citizen over the course of her life to be the expected death and or severe suffering of 1 to 2 humans. So using the more conservative estimate of 1 life lost per 1,840 tons of CO2 equivalent, Avram Hiller estimates that the expected harm of, say, for example, a Sunday joyride in a car, which emits 14.1 kgs of CO2 equivalent, as that of ruining someone's afternoon or depriving her of 5.37 hours of life. So this kind of thing, it's, I think, very clearly weighty enough to decisively outweigh the benefits to oneself of joyrides. And I think it provides a really strong moral case in favor of walking, cycling, and taking public transit instead of commuting by car. But it can plausibly be outweighed by such sufficiently serious considerations as the need to rush someone to hospital when they're having something serious going on, which is, I think, a pretty plausible thing for a theory to say. Moreover, I think a fuller estimate of the expected harms would take into account the effects on non-human animals. So to try to get a sense of this, Nemecek has argued that on a conservative estimate, there are at least 14 wild land vertebrates and 1,400 wild marine vertebrates for every human. And I'm using the vertebrates because they're very clearly sentient, as many as the neuroscience and philosophy of mind literature would tell you, and they're likely to be at least as vulnerable to the harms of climate change as humans are. So a fuller but still conservative estimate of the expected harms of the emissions from a Sunday joyride, I think, would also include a proportionally great harm to 14 land vertebrates and 1,400 marine vertebrates. So we got that figure of depriving a human of 5.37 hours of life based on a full human life expectancy of 80 years. So if, for example, each wild animal has a life expectancy absent climate harm of something like 3 years, a proportional expected harm to each of the 14 wild animals from 14.1 kgs of CO2 equivalent might be the deprivation of 3 out of 80 times 5.37 times 60, or 12.08 minutes of life. So you're shortchanging a huge number of individuals by doing that by taking a Sunday joyride, which again I think just adds substantially to the moral case against joyrides. So moreover, we can use Hiller's method to estimate the moral importance of reducing our air travel, for example, by substituting online video e-conferences, e-colloquia, and e-symposia, like this one, for ones that require traditional conferences that require flying. So it's been estimated, if you've seen the white paper for the Nearly Carbon Neutral Conference, that air travel accounts for 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions of an institution like the University of California at Santa Barbara. And a single round-trip continental flight can emit a full ton of CO2 equivalent, consuming one's entire carbon budget needed to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C. And the University of Alberta's Cool Institute for Advanced Study has estimated that for each year it holds its Around the World e-conference in the place of a traditional conference, it's eliminated the need for 200 flights and prevented the emission of 300 tons of CO2 equivalent. The expected benefit of doing this then is 300 out of 1840 of the benefit of saving the full lives of a human, 14 land vertebrates, and 1,400 marine vertebrates, or omitting to end the lives of an elderly human with a life expectancy of about 13 years and 14 land plus 1,400 marine vertebrates with a life expectancy of about 6 months. So according to the expected consequences approach, since it's morally imperative not to kill, say, a 69-year-old Canadian, the 14 elderly dogs for whom he cares at his animal sanctuary, and the 1,400 elderly fish living in a lake next to the sanctuary just to have a conference, it's at least as clearly imperative for us to bear the much lesser cost, which may actually be a net benefit given the savings of money and time and the greater accessibility to scholars of lesser means around the world, of having e-conferences like Around the World or nearly carbon neutral in the place of in-person conferences. Okay, so although he's sympathetic to something like this expected consequences approach's account of the moral case for reducing our emissions, Benward Gesang has argued that the expected consequences approach, as described above, doesn't straightforwardly support reducing our emissions. So Gesang's main contention is that there's a reasonably likely climate scenario in which it's not just unlikely, but impossible for small emissions to cause morally important effects. So in making this argument, Gesang draws an analogy to the Sorites paradox for vague properties, like that of being a heap or being bald, where two plausible views about these vague properties leads to a really, really implausible conclusion that nothing has these properties. So, in the case of heaps, so we might have this premise, some non-heaps. So, for example, a collection of 1 grain of sand is not a heap. And then we've got this tolerance thesis that for any number n of grains of sand, if a collection of n grains of sand is not a heap, then a collection of n plus 1 grains of sand is also not a heap. But together, those two, plus repeated applications of modus ponens, give us the conclusion that no heaps. All collections of grains of sand, no matter how many, fail to be heaps. Doesn't seem right. Okay, now most view vagueness and the consequent Sorites paradox as resulting from some sort of semantic or mental feature that there's no precise fact of the matter about what falls under our concepts signified by vague predicates like is a heap or is bald. So if Gesang wants to say this is something like in the metaphysical structure of the world causing climate emissions, he has to explain how there could be a metaphysical Sorites, out in the world, not just in our heads, in the case of greenhouse gas emissions, which makes it plausible that small additional greenhouse gas emissions can never make a difference between the absence or presence of morally important effects like floods, even though small amounts of greenhouse gases add up to large amounts, and large amounts do make these kinds of differences. So to try to make this plausible, Gesang invokes Julianevsky's discussion of a voltmeter with a 1 kilovolt margin of error. So if, after a series of single nanovolt increases, the voltmeter registers 1 kilovolt, Nevsky claims that we can't say that the last nanovolt increase made the difference between its doing so and its not doing so, because it's registering 1 kilovolt, when it does, is likely due to mechanical or environmental factors and not to the addition of some single nanovolt. So Gesang's trying to use this to motivate the idea that maybe small changes never make a difference, even though big changes in current, say, or greenhouse gas emissions do. But there's a huge problem with this, which is that without saying anything more about the mechanics of the voltmeter, this example does nothing to support the claim that it's impossible for a single nanovolt to make a difference between whether the voltmeter registers 1 kilovolt or not. So the most natural way for it to be likely that the last nanovolt failed to make the difference is for it to be likely that the voltmeter would have registered 1 kilovolt even if one had not added the nanovolt, because the other factors would have made it register 1 kilovolt anyway, even if one hadn't added it. But this certainly doesn't rule out there being some chance, perhaps quite small, that the single nanovolt increase did make the crucial difference. because the other factors would not have made the voltmeter register 1 kilovolt if one had not added the nanovolt, and the nanovolt was exactly what these other factors needed to push it over the edge and make it register 1 kilovolt. So the analogy to the climate case would then simply be what proponents of the expected consequences approach have been saying all along, which is that for any climate harm, it's most likely that it will happen or not, absent one's emission. But there's a small chance that one's emission will make the crucial difference and cause the enormous harm. But okay, I think though that there could be a more interesting reason why we can't truly say that the last nanovolt made the difference to the voltmeters registering 1 kilovolt, which is suppose that the voltmeter actually operates in an objectively chancy or metaphysically indeterministic way, so that given the entire history of the world at time t, the laws of nature actually fail to dictate that the voltmeter must be in some single state at time t+1. So if that's right, then given this complete history, it's both possible for the voltmeter to register 1 kilovolt and possible for it not to do so. So in that case, then there might be no determinate fact of the matter about what would have happened had one added any given nanovolt. In some of the closest possible worlds in which one adds the nanovolt, the voltmeter registers 1 kilovolt, and in others of these closest worlds, the voltmeter fails to do this. So then for any single nanovolt increase followed by the voltmeters registering 1 kilovolt, it's not determinately true that this would not have happened had one not added the nanovolt. It might not have happened, but it might still have happened. So Gesang actually also mentions quantum theory and the Copenhagen interpretation and objective chances. And I think this all supports his being most charitably understood as proposing what I've suggested, which is that in the climate change case, climate systems may exhibit the foregoing sort of metaphysical indeterminacy. So on that view, for small amounts of greenhouse gases, there's simply no determinate fact of the matter about what will happen if we don't emit. In some of the closest possible worlds in which we forego the emissions, the climate harms that otherwise might occur do not occur, while in others of these closest possible worlds, they might still occur. Okay, so if Gesang is right that there's no determinate fact of the matter about what would happen if we were to emit small amounts of greenhouse gases, I think he's in a sense correct that proponents of the expected consequences approach, like Morgan, Knapp, and Goodman, are wrong in claiming that there's a small epistemic probability that such emissions determinately will trigger significant climate harms. But because other proponents of the expected consequences approach have discussed how to apply it to cases of metaphysical indeterminacy, this is insufficient to actually make trouble for the general approach. So first, as Krister Bykvist has argued, if indeterministic processes yield precise objective chances of the outcomes that might obtain if we act in various ways, we should follow what we might call the indeterministic extension and apply the expected consequences approach using the objective chances as the probabilities of the outcomes to determine the fact-relative moral case in favor of the different acts. So, and I think the rationale here is really just the same as that in favor of the expected consequences approach in general. So when you can't know with certainty what would happen if you were to perform some act, in order to give appropriate weight to the ethical relevance of both, one, the harms and benefits that might obtain if you were to perform it, and two, the probabilities that these harms and benefits would obtain if you were to perform it, you should weigh against and in favor of the act, one, the harms and benefits that might obtain if you were to perform it, in proportion to two, the probabilities that these harms and benefits would obtain if you were to perform it. It doesn't really matter to the plausibility of this basic idea whether the lack of certainty and probabilities are due to your ignorance of facts or to the indeterministic structure of the world. So even if we assume that our emissions do have precise objective chances of causing various climate harms, we presumably don't know exactly what these chances are. Given our evidence, all we seem to know is that an emission's objective chances of causing harms are proportional to its size, and we know of nothing else that increases or decreases these objective chances. So as such, it seems that we should still follow Hiller and determine an emission's epistemically expected harms by multiplying the total expected harms of our collective emissions by the ratio of the given emission to the collective amount. So in that case, all Gesang's point about metaphysical indeterminacy really does is entail that the epistemic probabilities of harm are generated by both ignorance and objective chance. It doesn't change the underlying calculation of what we should do. Okay, now what though if Gesang's scenario of a metaphysically indeterministic climate system is one in which there are no precise objective chances of the various outcomes occurring if our various acts are performed? So in this kind of scenario, maybe it's, say, determinate that the chance of a climate harm taking place, given a complete world history, is greater than 0.5 and less than 0.9, say. But maybe there's no fact of the matter about whether it's, say, 0.653 or 0.6527 or many other values between 0.5 and 0.9. So if that's right, then while this can't be handled simply by the indeterministic extension, I think it can be handled by the indeterministic extension together with a natural and conservative extension of the expected consequences approach to imprecise probabilities that's been undertaken by other authors. So Susanna Rinard, for example, has prominently recently argued that a compelling way to motivate this kind of extension of the expected consequences approach to cases where the epistemic probabilities or justified degrees of expectation of various outcomes are imprecise. So according to what philosophers call a general supervaluationist approach to vagueness, for a claim with a vague predicate, like, say, Peter Singer's bald, to be determinately true, is for it to be true under every admissible precisification of the predicate, or every way of making the vague predicate precise, which would include, for example, someone with less than exactly 50% of typical hair distribution is bald, but also someone with less than 49% or less than 47% is bald, which is consistent with what's otherwise determinately true and false about it. So respects the fact that, say, someone with literally no hair is bald, and also the fact that it's not the case that someone with a full head of hair distribution that's typically distributed is bald. So since claims about imprecise probabilities employ vague predicates for the probabilities, the supervaluationist approach supports what we might call the supervaluationist principle for probabilities, according to which if probabilities are imprecise, but the expected harms of an act outweigh its expected benefits on every admissible precisification of the probabilities, then you determinately should not perform the act. So to see why this is plausible directly, suppose that for every way of making precise the probabilities of the harms and benefits that might obtain if you were to perform an act, which is consistent with what you know, the expected harms outweigh the expected benefits. Then the ethical significance of the act's possible harms and their range of admissible likelihoods of occurring seems to unequivocally outweigh the ethical significance of its possible benefits and their range of admissible likelihoods of occurring. And it doesn't really matter to the plausibility of this rationale whether the imprecision in the probabilities is due simply to your ignorance of facts that would justify having precise expectations, or indeed, in the case we're describing here, to the world's having an imprecise, objectively chancy structure. So even if Gesang's right that a plausible climate scenario involves our emissions having objectively chancy effects without precise objective chances, we can use the supervaluationist principle for probabilities to apply the expected consequences approach. It would be straightforward to apply this approach if we knew all there was to know about an act's objective chances of causing climate harms. So, for example, if we knew that a given joyride had a propensity between 1 in a million and 1 in 10 million of causing a flood that could be expected to inflict harm equal to the loss of 100 lives of 80 years, then because the benefit to us is trivial in comparison to someone's losing anything between 70 days and 7 days of life, the moral case against the joyride is determinately decisive. Now, in practice, of course, if we assume any remotely realistic kind of scenario with imprecise probabilities of our acts causing harm, we don't know all there is to know about our acts' imprecise objective chances of causing various climate harms. Given our evidence, all we seem to know is that an emission's admissible ranges of chances of causing harms are proportional to its size, and we know of nothing else that increases or decreases these ranges of objective chances. So it seems that given our evidence, once again, we should use Hiller's method of determining an emission's epistemically expected harm by multiplying the total expected harms of our collective emissions by the ratio of the emission size to that of the collective amount. The epistemic probabilities of harm that are then generated not only by our ignorance of facts, but by precise objective chances, but they're exactly what they would be if they were, as Hiller and Morgan Knapp and Goodman suggest, due entirely just to ignorance of facts and the underlying causal structure was completely deterministic. So even if Gesang is correct that our emissions may have imprecise objective chances of causing harm, these modest extensions I've described of the expected consequences approach entails that it's just as important to reduce our emissions as it would be if their effects were fully deterministic. Okay, so as we've seen then, the expected consequences approach provides a clear explanation of why we should take both political and personal action to reduce our ecological footprints. In environmental collective action problems like that of anthropogenic climate change, the collective result of our acts, like emitting greenhouse gases, is extremely harmful. But emissions far less than the sum total of all anthropogenic greenhouse gases have small chances of crossing thresholds and causing the more likely butterfly effects of the chaotic climate system that result in great harm. Because an emission's chance of having these effects is proportional to its size, and we know of nothing else that makes any given emission more or less likely to have these effects, we can determine emissions' expected harms by multiplying the total expected harm of our collective emissions by the ratio of the emission size to that of the collective amount. In doing so, we can see that because policies like a Green New Deal in the United States would reduce the amount of CO2 equivalent by hundreds of billions of tons, it can be expected to save hundreds of millions of lives. As such, we must vote and campaign for policies like the Green New Deal because, although our votes and those of others we may convince to vote for the Green New Deal are very likely to make no difference to the enactment of these policies, they have small chances of winning the election and making all the difference to whether they get enacted. The expected benefit, as we've seen, of an average vote is for a Green New Deal in the United States is something like between saving 5 and 10 full human lives, which massively outweighs, of course, the cost to us of having to go and vote. Now, this applies, however, just as much to actions within our personal as our political lives. A single choice of purchasing plant-based alternatives rather than a chicken's corpse has a small chance of omitting to cause an enormous number of additional chickens to be tortured and killed at the cost of much greater environmental destruction, making its expected benefit equal to that of omitting to torture and kill one chicken with the attendant ecological destruction of doing this just for the taste pleasure of eating her for certain. By going vegan, one can be expected indeed to each year directly prevent the deaths of somewhere between at least 232 and 443 vertebrate animals, with the additional benefits to wild animals and other humans of using up to 2.83 fewer acres or just 1/18 as much land and omitting at least 1.5 fewer tons of CO2 equivalent. We can also prevent a great deal of expected harm by reducing our flying and using video technology to hold our academic meetings online without the need to travel, as we're doing here. As we've seen, a single e-conference like around the world can be expected to save 300 tons of CO2 equivalent, which prevents an expected harm comparable to that of killing a 69-year-old Canadian, his 14 elderly dogs, and the 1,400 elderly fish in a nearby pond, which, of course, is absolutely morally imperative to not do just to have a conference. The adequacy of this account, as we've seen, has been challenged by Gesang's contention that it may be not only unlikely, but genuinely impossible for sufficiently small emissions to make a morally relevant difference. And in response, I've argued that Gesang has shown at most that if the laws of nature are not deterministic, there may be no determinate fact of the matter about what will happen if we emit some quantity of greenhouse gases. But, as I have explained, the expected consequences approach has already been extended to such cases of indeterminism. We should follow the indeterministic extension and use our acts' objective chances, or our best estimates of them, in our calculation of their expected consequences. If the objective chances of our acts are not precise, we should follow the supervaluationist approach and conclude that, if on every admissible persistification of the probabilities, the expected harm of emitting outweighs its expected benefits, then we should not emit. So from our evidential perspective, we don't know the precise or imprecise objective chances of any given emission making any given difference. All we seem to know is that the chances or ranges of chances of the emission causing harms is proportional to its size. So we should, it seems, still determine an emission's epistemically expected harm by multiplying the expected harm of our collective emissions by the ratio of the emission size to that of the collective amount. This means that even if Gesang is correct, that our emissions may have imprecise objective chances of causing harm, the expected consequences approach entails that it's just as important to reduce them as it would be if their effects were fully deterministic. And I therefore conclude that the expected consequences approach can surmount Gesang's challenge, and that it provides a fully adequate account of our powerful moral reasons to take both political and personal action to reduce our ecological footprints. And that's it. Thank you very much.